Baldur's Gate 3. Wow. Yeah, I'm certainly a little late to this party, but one of the greatest RPGs of all time, and a new high mark that many future games will be compared to, and I finally got to play it. In my Best Games of 2023 video, I mentioned that this title had a real chance of being my Game of the Year, if I hadn't delayed playing it until the last few days. Well, that suspicion was correct. Baldur's Gate 3 would have been my favorite new game from last year, and the primary reason for that is that, well, it's unlike anything else I've ever played. Baldur's Gate 3 is my first complete experience with a CRPG, and often it's the new experiences that stand out in our minds the most. New just feels so right. Having the opportunity to play something unknown to me just feels so fresh after spending the latter half of last year playing great but familiar experiences like Spider-Man 2, Lies of P, and Starfield. Pairing up a novel experience to me with my whimsical admiration for fantasy tropes and settings, and I was hooked from the first few minutes until the final boss encounter. Every fall, I make time to visit my local Renaissance fair and just absorb the scenes, the sights, the foods, the performances, the costumes, and the general atmosphere, and Baldur's Gate 3 managed to capture nearly that entire feel. It's the most hooked I've been in a fantasy setting since playing The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt 9 years ago. Whoa. And yeah, that's one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. Okay, let's rein it in. I'm definitely gushing at this point without really establishing why, but that's what this video is for, outlining the game and sharing why it clicked with me. If you're a CRPG expert or are looking for a really deep dive into Baldur's Gate 3, then this video really won't be what you're looking for. As a newcomer to the genre, I can't speak on its strengths compared to other titles, both within and outside of the franchise. You may still enjoy the video, I hope you stick around, but I just want to be upfront about my lack of experience with this style of game. Conversely though, if you are a newcomer to CRPGs, the language I use here may speak to you more as I assess what worked and what didn't as a novice venturing into it for the first time. As for spoilers, I don't intend to get carried away with them, but it is an experience that's worth having as it comes, so you've been warned. Before I dive head first, allow me to tell you the number one reason for why this game clicked with me so well: narrative choice and consequence. While I did my best to endure through this new form of combat, what pushed me along truly was the freedom afforded by the title. Whether it's openly permitting you to tackle quests in any order, speaking to companions and NPCs with whatever tone you like, choosing to be lawful good, chaotic evil, or anything in between. It's all just there, so much freedom, nothing is stopping you from choosing for yourself how to play. This is commendable, but choice means nothing if there are no consequences. Looking at you, Starfield, and that's what Baldur's Gate 3 does better than any game I've ever played before. No matter what you choose, the game world and its characters almost always have a reaction that supports or pushes back against you, as we will come to see. It's brilliant, and it's the main reason why I find myself recommending this game to anyone instead of just CRPG or RPG fans. You will get out of it what you put into it, and then some, and it just feels so nice to play something that respects me as a player while also making sure the world doesn't revolve solely around me. So yeah, play this game, and if you want to hear more about it, let's get into my full review. Let me tell you something, folks. Before I even booted up the game, I spent about 2 hours on YouTube watching tutorial videos to try to familiarize myself with the setup of these games. I want to give a special shout out to Lucky Ghost here on YouTube for his beginner's guide. It certainly helped inform me on how the game would play, but more so in how to approach character building. In Baldur's Gate 3, you can be whatever you want to be, a creature from any sort of race, with any sort of skill set or role, and with a background story as mundane or as wild as your imagination desires. After spending about 35 minutes going through the character creator process, I realized quite quickly that this is one of the most robust creators ever made, and it's surprisingly player-friendly, even for newcomers. After choosing a basic body type and sex, you're taken through a multitude of categories like race, stats, spells, and class one at a time, with plenty of tooltips to assist you if you're not sure what something means. When choosing a race, you'll not only get a preview of what your character could potentially look like, but you'll also get a list of all the abilities, skills, proficiencies, and spells your new character will have access to from the very start. While displaying so many of them may appear overwhelming, it's quite easy to wrap your mind around outside of a few relatively new terms like cantrips and saving throws, but even these are explained rather well. We're talking about things like proficiencies with certain weapon types, or having heightened stats like perception or charisma. It's all terminology that players should be familiar with, even if they aren't big video game fans. I mean, you don't have to have a PlayStation to know what charisma is. By keeping it simple and offering extra explanations, new players aren't left overly confused when creating their character, and that's great. Alongside of this ease of access, the variety in builds is what truly makes this staggering. I want to highlight all the options here. There's 11 races: elf, half-elf, tiefling, drow, human, githyanki, half-orc, gnome, dwarf, dragonborn, and halflings. Within each race, there's a few different subclasses that may grant an extra skill while potentially fleshing out your character's origin a bit more. For me, I wanted to stick with the theme of trying new things by ignoring my usual overwhelming desire to play as a strong, barbarian human, and instead I chose to play as a short and frail gnome. Knowing that combat would be a brand new setup for me, I wanted to try talking my way out of hostile situations, and gnomes started with advantage rolls involving charisma, wisdom, and intelligence. It seemed pretty good, so I rolled with it, as well as playing as a forest gnome so I could speak to animals. Next up, there's 12 classes including Barbarian, Bard, Fighter, Druid, Warlock, Cleric, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Sorcerer, Rogue, and Wizard. Roles for tanks, healers, and magic users alike, with options to multi-class as you level up, although I didn't pursue that this time. I had to keep things simple. Pushing temptation to the side once more, I picked a class with seemingly very little combat proficiency: a Bard. I wanted to play as a deceptive bard, a greedy shyster of sorts, one with a good heart, but a tendency to look after himself first and foremost, so long as the cost to others wasn't too crazy. And what better way to feign innocence and avoid a beating than by entertaining the masses with song and dance? A little extra persuasion skills wouldn't hurt either, so I picked the Gilded Artisan background to get a boost there. I knew I wanted this to be the personality shell of my character, and the creator here allowed me to build something to match it with stat boosts to back it up. What more could you ask for? Picking my instrument of choice was just the cherry on top. After that, it's on to stats and abilities. For some reason, base character stats are referred to as abilities, which struck me as an odd choice given abilities is usually a term that you'd apply to something like a skill tree, not an inherent component of your character, but it's all good. Most of your base stats will be defined by your race and your class, but you're given the option to boost one by 1 point and another by 2 points to flesh things out a bit more. From here, you'll choose some different skills to be proficient in. Again, I opted for persuasion, but there's many different ones like medicine, history, and more. These can help inform your intended playstyle by buffing out your vision. The stealth skill makes sense for a rogue, while wisdom may fit an old wizard quite well. You know, that sort of thing. And finally, you get to sculpt your character's physical appearance from head to toe, or, well, head to crotch, I suppose. I've seen creators with more options to build a physical look for your avatar, but honestly, I felt what was on offer here was more than enough. Regardless, I spent more time in this creator than any ever before, and I came out the other side having formed a character that met the vision that I was hoping for to a T. It almost felt like Larian Studios had anticipated what I wanted and gave me the tools to make it, and I have to imagine many others will feel the same regardless of what race, class, background, and whatever else they have in mind. It was an empowering way to start my journey because they avoided using too much specific video game jargon. I understood what I was reading and the choices I was making, which gave me confidence as I went into the adventure. Let's start our examination of the game itself with a look at the world building. Starting with the physical world they've built here, and perhaps the most important thing to note is that this isn't one single continuous open world. Instead, it's a series of smaller maps with other areas branching off of them. Normally, breaking up a massive map into many smaller ones can make the world feel disjointed. I'm reminded of the Outer Worlds, but Baldur's Gate 3 never suffers from that. Even with the loading screens divvying up each area, I never felt pulled out of the experience, as each branching location felt like a natural extension of the place you had just been. And even when it doesn't, such as discovering a massive underground cave system, you're still left with a sense of awe, like you've discovered something new. You never get that weird Dark Souls 2 vibe where an elevator going up seemingly leads to a volcano in the sky. No, it all just fits together wonderfully to create a very dense fantasy setting. I think one underrated element of the level design is how each of the game's 3 acts offers up a new environment to explore in terms of aesthetics. With each zone being so rich in content, it would be very easy to feel overwhelmed if all of this was housed in a map without much variation. For example, if the entire game took place in the forest lands of Act 1, that would get really tiresome over 70, 80, 90, or 100 hours of gameplay. But instead, the 3-act structure allowed for variation, with each act having its own unifying identity, with zones built off of it that make it seem like natural extensions. For example, Act 1 is about exploring a dense wilderness while sticking to the traveler's roads, with only a few settlements lurking between the trees. Built into the forest land is a long-abandoned temple, a hidden alcove of druids, a few cave systems, a marsh, and a few other settlements, all things that make sense for the woodlands. It also contains a giant cave system underground called the Underdark, which broke up the environmental monotony in the game's biggest act. By the way, finding that Underdark area, wow, that really reminded me of the elevator that brought you to the Siofra River in Elden Ring. I might be misremembering the name of that location, Siofra, I think it was, something like that. But yeah, it's just that holy shit moment that makes you wonder just how big the game actually is. And then Act 2 takes your party to more woodlands, but with a dark twist. These are the Shadowlands cursed by a local tyrant. The bright greens and blues and the sunny skies are replaced with a miasma of decay and darkness, a strong visual contrast cluing the player in that shit's about to start hitting the fan now. There's a weightiness to this environment. The darkness feels like the Mad King's gaze, constantly watching you as you creep through the ruined land. It's a fantastic change of pace. And then Act 3 takes us to the titular city, Baldur's Gate, for a bit of urban exploration. A small town outside of the city walls serves as a nice introduction to the societal structure, but it's your time within the urban sprawl that sticks with you the most. Venturing into shops, mansions, and inns feels wholly different than your time hiking and camping out early in the game. People are chatting, performing, laughing, and carrying on about their days as they walk the uneven pebblestone streets of the city. It makes this place feel active, as if the city goes on even when you aren't there. It's clear the team had a strong shared vision for how to bring this game world to life, regardless of if it's during the quiet, serene moments of the opening act or on the bustling streets of its final hub area. And it's safe to say they succeeded in realizing that vision. Of course, that's just one half of world building. They nailed the lay of the land, but how about the cultures of the people inhabiting it? Well, that's a trickier question because Baldur's Gate isn't really overly concerned with presenting cultures or unique societies. I mean, there are some. Again, I'm reminded of the Underdark, but they're more focused on the character-driven stuff here. We'll talk about all that in due time, but when it comes to presenting the lore of this world, the game really doesn't take too many stabs at it. That background story of Faerun isn't established or touched on, making me view this more as just another fantasy world, a good one, but one that I didn't have a lot of context for. Outside of the in-game events, and I guess a few references to the previous two games, I really didn't get a feel for what the people of Baldur's Gate stood for. In other words, I got to know characters, but I never got a feel of the overall beliefs and values that tied them all together. But truth be told, it's something that can be easily overlooked and forgiven because of the strength of the character writing. Now, that's what you can expect from the world building side of the game, but how does it feel to explore? In short, incredible. Despite having smaller maps, they are jam-packed with encounters and events that aren't mere fetch quests, but instead fully fleshed out adventures that can see you taking an hour-long detour or more to complete. For example, early in Act 1, you stumble across a man and a woman hovering over a dying man. The group makes reference to a cult called the Absolute, which does play a major role in the game's story, and then ask for your help in slaying the owlbear that killed their friend, who, the guy that's dying, he dies. So you venture out alongside these folks, you find the cave, you defeat the bear, and so on and so forth. I'll talk more about quest design later, but your build and choices play a large role in determining the outcome of this one simple quest. I've given you the core premise of it, but the point I want to make here is how natural it feels to stumble into these moments. Unlike in other games, there isn't a dude with a big exclamation point over his head symbolizing a quest giver status. No, you just sort of find yourself being pulled into quests as you explore, and talk with the people you come across during your travels. I should note that once you discover them, you can track quests in a journal with map markers, but the initial discovery is so worthwhile. It makes exploration feel so much more natural as you aren't being jerked around by markers on a minimap, but instead by the sounds of characters off in the distance or visions of a fight lurking just ahead. It's really a refreshing feeling. Larian took advantage of their smaller levels and maps and placed these moments into them in ways that ensure the player will stumble upon them while making it feel like a natural occurrence to those holding the controller. Even as the narrow walkways of the forest in Act 1 gives way to the bustling city streets full of shops and NPCs in Act 3, it's still quite easy to just stumble into lengthy and enjoyable quests. It's like Act 1 sort of trains you to find content by putting it on the main path, so that by the time things open up in Act 3, you're a pro at sniffing out unique locations and characters and picking up their quests. Exploration is handled so wonderfully because of how it rewards the player with meaningful interactions and quest lines that they find on their own, traces of the developer's hands expertly hidden just out of view. And for a game that uses the Dungeons & Dragons manual as a source of inspiration, but also as a core part of the experience, this should be no surprise. Look, I've never played D&D, but it isn't hard to see how Baldur's Gate 3's approach to exploration captures the spirit of it so gracefully. Stumbling into moments like finding this hag witch in the swamps, kicking off another optional side adventure, feels straight out of a dungeon master's lips. You can almost hear a DM saying, "And then the party stumbled across two men cursing at an old innocent woman," and then asking you to roll the dice for a perception check to see if you can determine her true nature. I mean, perhaps I'm dead wrong, but for me personally, it captures the image of D&D that I have in my mind so well, translating it to video game form seamlessly. As a result, it's one of the best experiences I've had in recent months with video game exploration. As you might expect from an RPG, especially one based on D&D, the story told here revolves heavily around the player and their choices on how to act and what to say. Famously, Larian Studios claimed that this game had 17,000 unique endings, which is of course a result of permutations based on a few different variables and key moments. There aren't really that many endings that are all completely different. No, the point is to emphasize the level of agency the player has over the narrative. As a result, any given playthrough can end in a myriad of ways, which is one of many factors that makes Baldur's Gate 3 super replayable. But what I want to provide here is a broad look at the game's overarching narrative while focusing on how quests inform it as well as alter it. Starting the game cues up a cutscene of an alien invasion, which, as a complete newcomer, struck me in a good way. Immediately, my fantasy expectations were being met with a layer of science fiction, which I absolutely adored. The scene shows a tentacle alien monster called Mind Flayers inserting a parasite into your brain through your eyeball. Yeah, gnarly. After creating your character, the tutorial is all about escaping the alien ship and picking up a few comrades in the process. It ends with you crashing your ship and slowly but surely bringing that party back together, including Lae'zel, the Githyanki fighter, Gale the wizard, Shadowheart the cleric, and Astarion the rogue. You'll pick up other allies as you explore, but for now, the most pressing matter is finding a cure to the parasite that's currently swimming through your brain, waiting to turn you into a Mind Flayer. You'll spend the majority of Act 1 searching for a cure, fearful that you may turn at any moment. I don't want to overshare and possibly spoil too much, so once that matter is concluded in a myriad of ways, which I will talk about a little later, then you move on to Act 2, which introduces a new threat, the Absolute. Someone or something is using these Mind Flayer parasites as a manipulative tool to coerce people into a religious cult. While it remains unclear who the culprit is, the most pressing matter during this stage of the game is taking down the supposedly immortal king, Ketheric Thorm, the assumed leader of the cult. And of course, dealing with him reveals a larger group at play, and Act 3 becomes all about stopping their plan before all of Baldur's Gate is destroyed, with all of its citizens becoming Mind Flayers. That's about as deep as I want to get on the narrative overview for two main reasons. One, because I don't want to spoil too much for you, but also because player choice largely determines how key moments play out. Truly, the player has a staggering amount of influence over the story, deciding the fate of Baldur's Gate for themselves, to be a brave presence, a reluctant hero, or a usurper of power. The decision on how to handle things is up to you. The overall tone of the narrative, as well as the fate of characters, falls mostly on your shoulders, which is incredible for an RPG, especially when it's able to give you so much power without catering the entire adventure around you. The believability of the world and its characters aren't sacrificed to satiate your desires. No, they strike a wonderful balance that allows the game to shine both as a preconceived world full of interesting characters and as an opportunity to grant the player a lot of freedom and expression. I'll talk more about those RPG elements later, but for now, I want to talk more about the team's approach to quest design. Never before have I seen mandatory and optional content tied together in such a seamless and satisfying way. The line separating the two feels paper thin, with content from both sides bleeding into each other perfectly. Throughout the course of the campaign, there's only a handful of mandatory objectives: find a cure, find Moonrise Towers, confront Ketheric Thorm, and stop the evil threatening Baldur's Gate. However, there is an incredible amount of content that supplements these objectives that are technically optional, even if they are worth doing. For example, in Act 1, the first place you'll look for a cure is a local druid grove. The grove's leader has been kidnapped and taken to a nearby goblin camp, and the interim leader wants to kick out a group of refugees to focus on protecting the grove. All of this is learned naturally through interacting with NPCs and is never forced down your throat. A quest is added to your log telling you to resolve this refugee crisis, but it's optional. However, perhaps the druids may be inclined to offer a cure if you help save their leader. Perhaps the leader knows about the cure. Perhaps even the goblins might offer a solution. Or how you could even just choose to not interact with any of it and instead trust Lae'zel and look for something with the Githyankies. You aren't forced to do any of these options, but pursuing it gets you closer to that goal of finding the cure while affording you a tremendous amount of role-playing opportunity in the meantime. I chose to search for the leader of the Druids and ask for his help with a cure. This meant infiltrating the goblin camp, saving some prisoners, and killing off their leaders. But I also could have helped the goblins, killed off the druid leader, and recruited a completely different ally into my party instead. But don't think of this as a black and white choice, either goblins or the druids, as there's a lot of factors that can influence the final outcome for the druid grove, the refugees, and the goblin camp. The choices were truly up to me, and this was but one questline on offer here in the first act of the game. And this, like I said, it's just one quest. One! I'm glad to say the rest of the experience maintains this level of player expression through each of its many quest lines without faltering. There are a handful of quests that might not tie directly into the main story, especially in Act 3, but even those are well thought out and extrapolated on, making nothing you do feel like filler. Larian Studios laughed at the idea of simple fetch quests, choosing instead to generate great quests that tied into the overall story being told by supplementing it instead of distracting from it. Cohesive. That might be the best word to describe the team's approach to quest design. This remains true of the companion quest lines as well, as most of the major party members have their own fleshed out backstories and challenges to face. For me personally, I played through most of the game with Karlach, Will, and Shadowheart, and so I focused mostly on their companion quest lines for this run, leaving the rest to be explored in another playthrough. As a side note, there's 6 origin companions that can easily be recruited, and 4 additional ones that take a bit of work to see them join up with your camp. If you want to shuffle your party around constantly, you can, but for me, focusing on 3 meant that the next time I play through the game, to make different choices and whatnot, I can also get to know a whole new party and see how they influence and contribute to the story and the adventure in addition to doing their quest lines. Seriously, the replayability in Baldur's Gate 3, staggering. Anyway, companion quests. Just like the optional side quests, companion quests do a wonderful job of tying themselves neatly into the overall direction of the narrative. The companions have the added benefit of rich backstories and wonderfully realized personalities brought out by great writing and acting, but for now, let's focus on the quests themselves. It feels like you hardly have to go out of your way to progress their quest lines as you stumble into the required characters or locations quite regularly. Not to mention, these quest lines unfold naturally through Act 1, 2, and 3, which leaves an enduring mark on your playthrough, instead of being a forgettable one-off mission never to be referenced again. Let me walk you through one of these quest lines to highlight the richness. Karlach, a mighty tiefling barbarian, is an escapee from hell. Literally. She was a prisoner soldier of Zariel, the Archduchess Demon of Avernus. Originally, you and the party stumble upon her with the anticipation of killing her to progress another companion, Will's, questline. But through dialogue, it's clear that she has a good heart and got mixed up in a bad situation. After joining your party, she opens up more and more about her backstory and how Zariel implemented an engine deep within her chest that lets her burn hot with fiery rage. It made her an excellent warrior, but robbed her of the ability to touch anyone else for fear that they'd burn to ashes. Her questline is about finding a way to fix up or remove the engine, but she's met with a grim fate. A mechanic is able to cool it down and grant her the ability to touch once more, but he also delivers some bad news. At some point, the engine will cease to work or explode, killing Karlach off, and there's nothing she can really do about it. The nihilism and defeatist mindset that kicks in is palpable as she turns her sadness into rage at the former ally who delivered this fate to her, Gortash. It just so happens that Gortash is one of the 3 main antagonists you'll encounter in Baldur's Gate 3, again, tying her story into that of the main story beautifully. Without too many spoilers, Karlach learns that revenge isn't always satisfying, but choosing to live your life meaningfully with the time you have is what means the most. It's not any sort of groundbreaking new lesson, but it's presented in a believable way that gets you on board with the character. And then, depending on the choices you make, you can actually reward Karlach's new mindset by finding an alternative way to stop the engine from exploding. Now, that recap took place in just a few moments, but please understand that this is a tale that plays out over a 70 to 100 hour journey, with a lot more detail and backstory than I'll go into here. At the same time, it's one of many companion stories that you'll have to juggle with the main story, other NPCs you meet, and even other companions. I mean, you can miss this whole questline if you side with Will's original goal of killing Karlach, which is insane, but again, empowering. There's a lot of crossover, and sticking with the companions I chose at the beginning throughout the whole playthrough is a big reason for why I missed out on some of the other companion questlines, chiefly Gale, Jaheira, and Astarion. But like I said, another run through this game will provide a whole new experience by venturing alongside of them. Amazing. So yeah, quest design is another massive strength for the game. They threw the notion of open world filler quests to the wind and focused on making the missions they had in mind as good as they could possibly be. They did this in a few ways. They created strong-minded characters and then challenged their worldviews. They built quests that deliver a lot of player agency and freedom without sacrificing everything else. And perhaps most importantly, they made it all feel seamless, blending mandatory and optional content together to form a complete adventure. My only knock with quest design is that much of it comes to a head in the game's final act. Between wrapping up the main story, finishing every companion quest, and completing the other miscellaneous quests found here exclusively, it became a bit overwhelming. Many storylines endure through the entire game experience, but I think it feels worse in Act 3 because of how many missions can overlap and interfere with others or your preferred playstyle. For example, Lae'zel's questline in Act 3 involves saving an NPC, but that character is being held by someone I viewed as an ally, and I thought by saving that NPC, it might piss off my ally. I didn't want to betray them, but I also didn't want to lose access to Lae'zel and camp, so I completely ignored that set of missions. But even by cutting out an entire chunk of quests like this, I still felt like there was so much to do in Act 3, perhaps just a bit too much. I don't think it's a problem that can be avoided, and it might not even be a problem at all for most. I mean, you might be sitting there thinking, really? Too much content? That's what you're complaining about? But, I mean, yeah, my initial solution was that certain companion quest lines could be finished before arriving in Act 3 to cut back on potential bloat, but that just feels like favoritism, so it's probably best the way it is now, but it did leave me with a bit of choice paralysis, especially as I yearned to see how the game's main story would conclude. My advice would be to finish up the quest lines of the party members you feel strongest about and leave the rest for another playthrough later down the road. Of all the problems the game could have, too many great missions and characters that you feel overwhelmed is probably the best to have. Let's shift our focus away from the plot and towards the characters themselves because they are special as well. Probably the best written I've seen since The Last of Us Part 2 4 years ago. And when you factor in the strengths of the performances and the consistent quality between hundreds of characters compared to that game's smaller roster, there's an argument to be made that Baldur's Gate 3 does it even better than The Last of Us. Even outside of your party members, the characters you encounter are so well designed, written, and acted that it feels truly special. I'm reminded here of characters like Mazura, a demon whom Will is binded to. She comes off as extremely cunning, clever, clerical, and a bit sinister without shoving it down your throat. There's also Dammon, a tiefling blacksmith who assists Karlach. Despite being a refugee himself, he's sympathetic to her struggles and agree to help regardless of his own dire circumstances. He shows off bravery, courage, and caring with his personality. And then there's Walbrin, a gnome in need of help. He's been kidnapped, leading to an initial sympathetic vibe towards that character. After all, his mate, Barkus, seems so wholesome despite his timid nature. But then, as you get to know Walbrin, you realize that he's sort of an asshole, like, majorly. Your expectations get flipped on their head in a great way, leading to another quest full of meaningful choice. These are but a few examples, and they are reoccurring characters, but you get a real sense of who they are as people through their actions and words, more so than can be said of other side characters in other games. Oh, and there's many characters like them throughout the game to find, to learn about, and to quest with. It's immaculate. And that is to say nothing of your main companions, whose greatest strength lies in the fact that they are unyielding in their personalities and beliefs unless you put in serious work to advance and finish their quest lines. They've all been well defined on the character alignment chart, from lawful good to chaotic evil, and everything in between. And even as they learn and grow, most of them stay loyal to those perspectives. This remains true even if it forces them to butt heads with other members of the party. For example, Lae'zel and Shadowheart are constantly beefing through the first two acts, as both of the groups they came from were in the midst of battle before the Mind Flayer invasion. They even almost kill each other one night during camp unless you can settle them down. Seriously, a party member can just straight up be killed if you fail the checks. A serious consequence, but one that ensures the believability of the characters. You see, they have their own beliefs that govern them. They aren't slaves to your every will and desire. God, the amount of times I want to write, "I'm looking at you, Starfield," throughout the script has been crazy. But this is what allows the characters to shine brightest. You can influence them in many ways, and even decide a lot of their fates, but they retain enough agency to make you feel like a circus ringleader, constantly juggling their personalities to try to keep everyone content and happy. Another factor that makes them so believable is how they react to the world, whether it's commenting on events happening during your adventure, trying to persuade you one way or the other, or just by quipping and gossiping about the latest character drama that's going on back at camp. You're constantly encouraged to chat with these friendly faces to hear their reactions and thoughts. I can't fathom how many voice lines had to be written and performed to accompany the sheer number of outcomes, but it's evidence of Larian's efforts to provide a world-class RPG, no expenses spared. Great characters stem from rich backstories and defined personalities and strong beliefs, but what takes them to the next level are the lessons they learn. And by guiding them through their companion quests, you can eventually see all these characters undergo some sort of change. At least the ones I completed. It keeps them feeling fresh and humbled, constantly evolving people in an ever-changing world. I don't want to say too much more on this front out of fear of too many spoilers, but remember what I described with Karlach and understand that it can be applied to many of your voyaging mates. So, we've established the strength of the world and its characters, but now it's time to hone in on your role within it, as you share the responsibilities of both adventurer and dungeon master. It all starts with your character's build, established in the opening minutes as I've already discussed, but then furthered by how you continue to reinforce them upon leveling and evolving their personalities through dialogue options. At the center of both factors, the hard builds and the projected personalities, is choice and consequence. Baldur's Gate 3 celebrates this more than any other game I've ever played by offering hundreds and thousands of potential choices and then following it up with tangible consequence. And in a game full of strengths, this is its strongest element, an ironclad resolve to honor player choice while making the world react accordingly. So let's see a little bit about how it's done. Starting with the hard builds. After creating your initial character, you'll level up 11 times as you play with a max level set at 12. By the way, I love how the game uses smaller numbers. It doesn't feel the need to be like, oh, you did 10 million damage. No, it's like, you did 15 damage, and that's good enough. I don't know why, but it makes things feel more grounded. Anyway, as you level up, depending on your class, different options will be made available to you, but they usually are cantrips, spells, proficiencies, boosting attributes, and an HP boost, as well as the option to multi-class. These are the sort of things that you're confronted with every time you level up. Of course, if you do multi-class, that route means neither of your selected classes can max out since the cap is at 12. So you could be like a level 4 Warlock and a level 8 Wizard, for example. The beauty though is that you begin multi-classing the very first time you level up with no restrictions on what you can mix and match. I just stuck with a Bard for my first run since I was learning on the fly, but as you learn more and more about the game, you can come up with some pretty sick builds owed to the flexibility. You also get the option to build your party members in the way you see fit, including multi-classing them if you want. Again, I stuck to the basics and didn't get too creative or inventive, but it worked for me as I dipped my toes into this style of game for the first time. It felt friendly to a newcomer like me, while also providing depth for those seeking it. Anyway, I built my Bard as a sort of jack of all trades, specializing mostly in dialogue checks, but giving him a variety of utility in combat and exploration. He could do some healing, he could turn invisible, he could cast a powerful AoE spell, and he could talk to animals amongst other things. The background I came up with for my character was one that is sort of like a snake oil salesman, constantly scheming without trying to hurt or maim. I justified his various utility roles by coming up with stories of how he got kicked out of towns as he tried peddling some scheme. And along the way, he picked up some useful skills that are helping out the party now. It helped me to inform my character's background. Let that be an example of how easy it is for your objective leveling choices to tie directly into subjective role playing. And a basic example would be like, if you want to play as a necromancer, you can choose options that allow you to speak to the dead and cast necromancy spells in combat. Again, that's a simple example, but there's a lot of ways to build your ideal character when leveling up. It's a lot of powerful options and meaningful choices without many restrictions, and that's a great thing for an RPG. This game is more than just choice though, it's about consequence, and we see that play out here in a way that, admittedly, it does in many other games, through opportunity cost. By choosing to multi-class or not, to learn a certain spell over another, or whatever else, you lose out on all the other potential options. You are forfeiting other possibilities in service of your choices at that time. Now, this isn't anything new for video games, mind you, and I think Baldur's Gate 3 excels at implementing consequence in other ways, but it is certainly an example of consequence, since you can't carry every spell, every cantrip, every item at all times. This also applies to your illithid power-ups. You collect more and more of those weird parasites as you play, and they can be used to upgrade like a certain skill tree as well if you want. But you can only choose so many without following a guide, so again, there's a little bit of opportunity cost. Oh, and I should note here that respecking is an option that's unlocked fairly early in the game, which is great. So yes, when it comes to building your character how you want, there is a ton of choice. Now, if you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you know that I'm a sucker for great dialogue options in games. Ascribing my character with a personality and traits means a lot, and dialogue is my favorite way of conveying that. Baldur's Gate 3 does not disappoint, always offering up a variety of tones to everything you say. You can ask for additional information, you can be well-mannered, you can be sarcastic, you can be pragmatic by just getting straight to the point, and if you really feel like it, you can just straight up attack the person, replacing those words with sharpened steel. These are your basic flavorings to season conversation how you see fit, but there are so many other factors that make dialogue feel so good here. So I want to go over 5 of them real quick. Number 1, Smartly, you can't always ask every question before the conversation advances, making it feel much more natural by maintaining a flow. Number 2, there's dice rolls going on unseen in the background that may grant you more information, such as a perception check that details the NPC's body language, cluing you in on if you can trust them or not. Number 3, there's a brilliantly included spoken narrator who can help paint the scene by adding insightful commentary. Number 4, your companions will weigh in on matters, especially those regarding their quest lines, fleshing them out as well. And number 5, there's dialogue options for additional dice rolls that tie into skills like history, medicine, deception, persuasion, and more. In order to succeed at those checks, you have to hit a certain number on a dice roll based on the outcome of that roll and the additional boost you get from a character's skill set. If you fail, there will be a consequence. These are all factors that take dialogue to the next level in Baldur's Gate 3, leading to an unparalleled sense of choice and consequence once more. Choosing to say one thing leads to an opportunity cost of all the other things you could have said. Failing a perception check by not leveling your character in a certain way can lead to missing out on critical information that might inform your next words. And failing any skill check may cause an NPC to turn hostile on you in a hurry. It's a brilliant set of mechanics working harmoniously to create believable outcomes. And that leads us right into the almighty dice, the ultimate governing factor in Baldur's Gate 3, chance. So many elements and systems in BG3 rely on a dice roll, from attacks and saving throws in combat, to speech checks in dialogue, to lockpicking doors successfully, to interpreting symbols in the world, and so much more. It may sound like an intimidating proposition. I mean, what if you fail a dice roll when you really don't want to? Well, that's what save scumming is for, and Baldur's Gate 3 isn't afraid to let you do it as much as you want. Again, it's another element of player choice. Reload an old save, or roll with the consequences. That debate aside though, I think it's a brilliant way of incorporating more consequence into the game. Because rolling a 1 always results in a critical failure, you can never be 100% certain that whatever you're trying to do will succeed. Conversely, rolling a nat 20 will always lead to a critical success, meaning even the toughest checks have a 5% chance of success, which is better than 0. The point here is that the dice adds a lot. Everything in the game is affected by it, and adding an element of chance to a game, I don't know, it just makes it a little more fun, a little less predictable, and to me, that's a good thing. For my playthrough though, the dice did become less and less of a factor as I continued to accrue more boosters like Shadowheart's guidance ability, as well as deception and persuasion expertise that granted me like plus 18 on every roll. Even as I was required to hit higher numbers, I still cleared them quite easily. However, I still failed some checks here and there, like resisting the partial transformation into a Mind Flayer, resulting in my character having these ugly black veins all over his face for all of Act 3. Still, that was in the late game. Early on, there was uncertainty on my dice rolls, and I could never be sure a persuasion or perception check was going to land successfully. Regardless though, it feels like the right choice for this style of game. Leaving things up to chance helps provide the world with a feeling of realism. Not everything is going to go your way every single time, but you can achieve those desired outcomes more frequently by preparing in the proper ways. You still may fail, but your odds will be increased. Rolling the dice is a risky proposition, one that can help you at the risk of setting you back. Another strong implementation of choice and consequence. And finally, I want to talk about the moment-to-moment choices you'll make as you explore the maps and events. As established, NPCs aren't marked as quest givers, but you still stumble into them naturally. Well, there's a whole other side of the game that you won't find without proper investigation. There are so many moments that reward player intuition and curiosity. By examining every object and NPC in the game, you can come to discover new things that were just lying dormant for you to find or to pass right by. Without the investigative spirit, you will just gloss right over them, unaware that they even existed. So let me give you some examples from early in the game. Probably my favorite in all of Baldur's Gate 3, this happens early in the Druid camp. There's some unassuming cows just feeding away. If you speak to the animals though, you come to realize that one of these oxen is a bit strange. If you pass an Arcana check, you'll learn that it isn't what it appears, but even upon passing a Persuasion check, it won't tell you much except it's going to Baldur's Gate. The ox will continue to appear in Acts 2 and Act 3, and eventually, if you help it, it will provide you a ring that gives you extra boosts on rolls while you're disguised. Unless, of course, you end up killing it like I did in Act 2. But anyway, it's a whole mini quest line that you can just miss by not investigating the camp meticulously and keeping an eye out for the ox, since it doesn't appear as a quest in your log. Nobody ever says to you, wow, that ox sure is acting strange. No, you just go by it, you notice it's called Strange Ox, and you're like, huh. And you're like, oh yeah, I have the speech to talk to animals, I should try that. And then you do it, and it's just like this whole thing that you could have missed. It's amazing, I love it. Some other examples, in Act 1, there's a party celebrating your restoration of the Druid Grove. With alcohol in the air, romance is at play. But by interacting with your companions in a certain order, you can make some of them hook up and comment on it the next morning. Again, completely easy to miss if you don't take the time to investigate. And then of course there's just entire sections that you can miss if you don't take the time to investigate, like this whole underground cave system. If I didn't move some boxes blocking an old farm door, I would have never found it, but here I was. So yeah, it's these little moments like this that mean so much. If you take the time and you make the active choice to search for things, the game will reward you, but the consequence is, if you don't go looking, you're gonna miss out on a lot of cool stuff. And another little thing I wanted to mention here in this little RPG section is how often skills and spells can aid you if you just remember that you have them. For example, I was faced with this really tough combat encounter in Act 3 that I failed a few times, but then I got an idea. I have the invisibility spell. So I cast that on my entire party and just walked past all the enemies without them even unsheathing their swords. I love that moment. I felt so rewarded for taking advantage of every option that my character had. A wonderful way of rewarding player expression and making my build meaningful. So hopefully this shows you that quest lines and funny and interesting companion interactions and even entire areas can be missed if you aren't diligent or built properly. The game rewards you for questioning and investigating everything, so make sure to stay inquisitive. I keep saying it, but just so many instances of choice being met with consequence, and it stacks up on top of each other to create a truly unique playthrough every time. Seriously, ask your friends how their playthrough went versus yours, and it will always be something different. And I love that. It's a great game because of it. Alright, let's focus on movement and combat. Navigating the world outside of combat is relatively simple. You're permitted to freely roam around the pathways with the camera up close or overhead like RPGs of yesteryear. Fast travel is included to get around easier, and it was useful as you'd expect because I did find myself getting lost quite often when relying just on the minimap. I was constantly referring to the full map to get a better picture of what direction I needed to go, and that was a bit of a nuisance as I played. Nothing too bad, but certainly noticeable. Every character, of course, has a few different actions they can do, but most important for exploration would be jumping. There's often split paths or areas overhead that will require you to do a bit of leaping. This was sometimes a pain for me, since I played as a gnome and had pretty low strength and mobility potential, but I could always switch to another character to investigate anywhere I couldn't. And yes, if it wasn't obvious yet, you really do have full control over your companions if you choose to play as them more often than I did. Anyway, yeah, navigation is about what you'd expect, same with movement. Okay, combat. First off, let me give a huge disclaimer here. Combat is super deep with tons of options, but for my playthrough, I kept things simple. The game recommended playing on an easier mode as a newcomer to the genre, and so I did spend the majority of my time playing on that setting. If this invalidates the video for you, especially the combat section, I understand, but please know that as a newcomer, combat and its many wheels were a bit daunting at first. The game goes over the basics of combat like actions, bonus actions, and saving throws, and provides written tutorials for more, but a lot of the complexity is on your shoulders to discover and to understand. Now I will say, after doing a single playthrough, I do feel much more equipped to tackle a normal difficulty where every turn in combat matters much more given your more restricted health pool. A tighter focus on building combat-ready characters seems like a requirement if you're gonna play on normal mode and definitely if you play on hard, but for now, let me just speak to the experience I had. There is a staggering number of factors that influence any given combat encounter. I'm talking about movement, actions, bonus actions, abilities, spells, enemy types, enemy resistances, weapons and armor and how you wield them, dice rolls, healing potential, status effects, friendly fire, environmental objects, terrain, leverage, damage types, dashing, jumping, throwing, and much, much more. You seriously need to take some time to read and think during combat if you're going to be as efficient as possible, especially if you aren't playing on easy. I'm going to try to simplify it as much as I can, but please understand that there is a vast number of complex systems working behind the scenes to determine the outcome of any particular action. So when it's your character's turn in combat, you can do three things. Move a certain distance around the arena, do an action identified in green, such as attack, casting a spell, healing, dashing, or what have you, and then you can also do a bonus action, usually doing some form of limited damage, or providing buffs or debuffs, jumping, or again, healing. There are ways to increase your movement distance and to do more actions in a single turn, but those are the basics. Considering your character's role is important. Melee users need to get closer, healers and ranged companions can hang back, and gaining leverage is always useful. So when you choose to attack in Baldur's Gate 3, a dice is rolled to determine the specific damage you will do based on a number of factors. The more of those factors that are in your favor, the more damage you do. For example, shooting down on an enemy from above gives you an advantage, allowing that dice roll to happen twice, selecting the highest outcome between the two rolls. Of course, all of this applies to your enemies as well. There's many situations that may provide a disadvantage for you, where the outcome is determined by the lower of the two dice rolls. The key to combat is maximizing your advantages as often as possible by taking advantage of height bonuses, enemy movement tendencies, enemy weaknesses, and more. Identifying these factors that will influence any given encounter and then planning accordingly are paramount to success in Baldur's Gate 3. For me, playing on the easier mode allowed me to make the mistakes that led to learning for future runs. I ran Will as my primary ranged option, using AoE spells to kill enemies funneled into a location, taking advantage of many elemental attacks to maximize damage output, and using Eldritch Blast to knock enemies back, sometimes off of ledges. I ran Karlach as my primary melee beater, tanking damage using heavy armor and using her rage skill to hit enemies 3 times in one turn. And then I ran Shadowheart as my cleric healer, making sure to utilize her Guardian of Faith to do extra damage to would-be killers. And my gnome bard, well, like I said, he was a jack of all trades. He had potential to heal, to attack twice, to do AoE damage, to turn people invisible, and inspire others to do more damage using my musical prowess. Now, again, this isn't anything too complex. The game can be a lot more complex if you want it to be, and for me, I just needed to pick up the basics, and this approach worked. I didn't min-max all that much, but it worked for me, and it sowed the ideas of how combat should flow in the game. And now next time, I feel better equipped. So if you are a newcomer, probably start the game on easy, but if you're used to these sorts of games, and this isn't your first rodeo, then yeah, normal, you'll probably be just fine. I mean, now that I have the basics down, I'm eager to make more specialized builds through multi-classing, and finding ways to use the environmental objects in my favor more, like blowing up explosive barrels, or, just pushing myself more next time in combat. If you're not a fan of turn-based combat, then this really won't do much for you, especially because of all the layers of complexity. It isn't the back and forth of Pokemon, for example. It's much more detailed and involved, forcing you to plan ahead almost like a strategy game would. Enemies are really not to be trifled with, and some encounters can go upwards of 45 minutes, with most being around 10 to 20 minutes. It's staggering, and if you want to hear more detail about combat, then I suggest looking up other videos that can capture the complexity far better than I can after one playthrough. Alright, as always, let's wrap up this video with a quick look at the presentation and the performance. In terms of art direction and style, the game had a really strong vision. Anytime you can intermingle sci-fi elements with fantasy elements without the two being jarring next to each other, you've accomplished something. And that's certainly the case here, as seeing the very alien mind flayers talking to my dapper young 15th century gnome never struck me as odd or out of place. Despite all the variety in the races, they all feel like they belong in this world, intermingling amongst each other. And I think that's because all of them feel like offshoots of humans, allowing us to process them as such without dipping into the uncanny valley. Another element that impressed me here was the choice of colors. So often fantasy worlds fall into either dingy and dark colors or a lot of muted dull colors. Not the case in Baldur's Gate 3. The world starts out so bright, full of rich greens and vibrant blues all throughout Act 1. Including so many tieflings here was also brilliant because it introduces a little bit of red into the world, a color that's not often seen in nature outside of fall settings and volcanoes. And then you get to Act 2 and go through the shadow-cursed lands, full of grays but also including a lot of purple to keep things from getting so stale to look at. The piercing oranges and yellows coming off of fires also helps. And then in Act 3, you do get more grays and browns, but the texture work is really well done, making them come to life in a whole new way. A rich color palette is a great sneaky way to get players to enjoy your game more, and Baldur's Gate 3 certainly delivers. In terms of character designs, I think they did an immaculate job promoting masculine and feminine features while also informing what a character stands for. Astarion's clothing inspires images of royalty, while Halsin's really do feel like a dude living his life in the woods. Wonderful animations and movements also add a lot of style, flair, and personality to each character, and an attention to detail endures throughout the game. My favorite example being how every NPC taller than me would actually look down while speaking to me since I was a short-statured gnome. I love that. All in all, the animations throughout the game were fantastic and brought the characters to life. The other factors that made for such strong character performance was, of course, the writing that was never heavy-handed and the voice work that never felt phoned in at all. Seriously, the voice work in this game is impeccable. Even characters that are around for like 10 minutes will have convincing and whimsical performances. I'm reminded especially of this yellow floating elephant. When I consider this, he was the best. A strong applause needs to be given to the entire art, writing, actors, and animation teams for what they've accomplished here in bringing the world and the characters to life. And musically, yep, the game wowed as well, with so many strong fantasy sounds coming from iconic instruments like the lute. I talked earlier about how this game makes me want to go back to the Renaissance Fair so badly. Well, the music played a large role in that. I found myself sitting at camp sometimes just listening to the theme. And honestly, I wish I had spent more time just performing for crowds, playing into the bard character that I was. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right, but the composer, Borislav Slavov, did an immaculate job here, really bringing the world to life. And environmental sounds also impressed me throughout, no doubt about it. And finally, on performance, I had a mostly rock-solid time playing on my PlayStation 5. There is a performance mode, as well as a quality mode, and I played on performance. It seems the game is capped at about 30 FPS on console, and I very rarely noticed any lagging, although there were certainly some pop-in textures from time to time. I didn't experience any hard crashes, and so the biggest note on bad performance would be how the game can chug during combat. There were a handful of instances where the game seemingly struggled to load enemy actions. There were times when the camera would just shift to the enemy in turn and they wouldn't do anything, for sometimes 30 seconds at a time. Or I would attack an enemy and it wouldn't register right away. There'd be like a lag or a buffer period until the attack landed. These were sometimes a pain in the ass, but it was the only real major negative of their performance besides the few instances of pop-in. Baldur's Gate 3 is one of those games that other titles will be stacked up against to see if they can measure up. It's one of those rare few titles that comes along every few years where it's clear that no component of the design has been phoned in. The development team at Larian Studios didn't settle for mediocre, they didn't settle for good, and they didn't even settle for great. No, they wanted to create a title that pushed gaming expectations forward, and they succeeded. The amount of things they've crafted with care, knowing that not every player was going to see, hear, or experience them, is staggering. They chose to design many variations to quest lines and characters to ensure that player choice meant something, and that it was always rewarding to see how your selections would affect the details and events of the story. It's that passion for the project that carries all the way through, from the character creator to the time the credits roll, and subsequently on every new playthrough. From world building to quest design to combat to dialogue to narrative to choice and to consequence, Baldur's Gate 3 rarely ever stumbles, and it's quite clear how this was 2023's Game of the Year for many. I mean, I didn't even touch on it in this video, but you can even play the game multiplayer if you want with your friends. Like, it's crazy. Everything you could ever want from a CRPG is in this game. If I had played and finished it in 2023, it would have been the Game of the Year for me. It's exceedingly rare to see a game celebrate choice and consequence equally in their storytelling and in their gameplay, making Baldur's Gate 3 a game that folks are going to be talking about for a long time. Whether you're a seasoned veteran of the genre or franchise, or completely new to it all, BG3 is an incredible experience that should be undergone by any fan of RPGs. I've never played something that honors my agency as a player while not sacrificing on the world and its characters as much as I have here. I don't think it'll find its way into my top 10 or 20 games of all time list simply due to the genre, but it's no doubt the new defining experience for CRPGs, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who disagrees. So, simply put, I recommend this game. I suggest going into it with an open mind, and allow your faith to be rewarded. Thanks for watching. Alright guys, that's my assessment of Baldur's Gate 3. As I wrap this video up, I do want to re-acknowledge that this wasn't the most detailed take on the game, despite the video's length. There's been a few experiences over the last few years that I've spent dozens of hours with, and it still feels like I don't have a full grasp on it, like Tears of the Kingdom and Elden Ring, and now Baldur's Gate 3. It feels like I've just barely scratched the surface, and I'm just kind of summing up those initial thoughts. Even though the video's over an hour, feels like I've hardly talked about anything, but yeah, I guess I'm just eager to replay this one if I can ever find the time. Anyway, what did you think of Baldur's Gate 3? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. Join our Discord, the link is below. And as always, guys, have a nice day and take care.